The whispers of the 911 console. They tell you that the headset is just a tool. They tell you to keep your emotions in a box, under your desk, locked away. But they don't tell you what happens when the box starts to leak. My name is Sarah. I spent 10 years behind a console in a windowless room in rural Washington. 10 years of hearing people on the worst day of their lives. You'd think you've heard everything. Screams, car crashes, the silence of a heart stopping. But then came the night of January 24th. The snow was coming down so hard outside that the world felt muffled. The dispatch center was empty, except for me and the hum of the servers. It was 3:11 a.m., the dead hour. That's when the light on line 4 started blinking. No caller ID, no GPS coordinates. Just a black void on my screen. I pressed the button. My voice was a professional mask. 911, what is the location of your emergency? Nothing. Just the sound of wind. But not the wind from outside. It sounded like wind blowing through a very long metallic tunnel. Hello? Is anyone there? I asked, my grip tightening on the pen. Then a sound that made my spine turn to glass. A clicking noise. Tuck, 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 like a fingernail tapping on a microphone. I can see you, Sarah, a voice whispered. It was a woman's voice, but it sounded wrong, like two voices speaking at once, one slightly behind the other. I can see the mole on the back of your neck. I can see the photo of your dead sister tucked behind your monitor. My hand flew to my neck. My heart wasn't just beating, it was trying to escape my chest. Nobody knew about that photo. I had hidden it there only yesterday. Who is this? I hissed, my professional mask shattering. This is an emergency line. I will have the police at your door in minutes. The clicking sound stopped. The voice came back, closer this time, as if she was standing right behind my headset. But Sarah, I am already at the door. I'm just waiting for you to look at the security feed. I slowly moved my mouse to the CCTV icon. My breath was coming in short, jagged gasps. I clicked on Entrance Hall. The screen flickered, static. Then, the image cleared. The hallway was empty. The heavy steel door was locked. But then I saw it. On the floor, a trail of wet, black sludge leading from the bottom of the door, all the way to the elevators. I switched to elevator cam. The doors were open. The elevator was empty. But the walls were covered in handprints. Small, child-sized handprints made of that same black, oily substance. And then I heard it. In the real world, not through the headset. Ding. The elevator at the end of my hall had just reached the 4th floor. My floor. I ripped the headset off. The silence of the room was now terrifying. I looked at the console. Line 4 was still active. Even without the headset, I could hear the voice coming through the tiny speaker on the desk. Sarah, don't hide under the desk. That's the first place I'll look. I didn't think. I grabbed my keys and ran for the emergency stairs. My boots pounded against the concrete. Thud, thud, thud. I reached the ground floor, my lungs burning, and burst out into the freezing night air. I ran to my car, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I saw the sunrise in the rearview mirror. But when I got home, I realized something. Something that has kept me from sleeping for 3 days. When I ran out of that building, I left my headset on the desk. But when I got into my car, I felt something heavy in my coat pocket. I reached in. It was my headset, still warm. And through the earpiece, I can still hear that clicking noise. Tuck, tuck, tuck. It followed me home. And I think it's tired of waiting. The vertical maze. I didn't look back. I knew that if I turned my head to face the figure in the reflection, I would lose whatever shred of sanity I had left. My heart was a drum, beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Thump, 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 thump. I lunged for the door. The black sludge was slippery, like stepping on a nest of eels. I felt it pull at my boots, trying to fuse my soles to the floor. I let out a choked sob, gripped the heavy metal handle, and pulled. It was locked. 911 dispatch centers are secure facilities. Sarah, the girl's voice whispered, now coming from the shadows of the ceiling. You locked yourself in? You wanted to be safe. But safety is just another word for a cage. I pounded on the door. Boom, boom, boom. The sound echoed down the empty hallway outside. I knew no one would hear me. The night shift was down to just me, and the security guard, Miller, was always at the far end of the building in the basement. I looked at the sludge. It was climbing the legs of my chair now, dissolving the fabric, turning everything it touched into a void. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold brass of my emergency key card. I swiped it. The light turned red. Invalid. I swiped it again. Invalid. I looked at the card. It wasn't my ID anymore. The plastic had turned a deep blood red color, and in the center, where my photo should be, was a picture of the red door in the forest. Open it, Sarah! the voice urged, sounding closer. Open the door to the hallway. Let's see if the hallway is still there. I kicked the door, one last desperate blow. To my horror, the metal felt soft, like hitting a mattress. The door didn't swing open. It melted away. I stumbled out into the hallway, but it wasn't the white, sterile corridor of the 4th floor. The walls were lined with old, damp wallpaper, peeling and stained. The carpet was gone, replaced by rotting floorboards that groaned under my weight. And the lights. The fluorescent tubes were gone. Instead, there were flickering candles held by iron brackets on the walls. I was in the Miller house. The house from my nightmares. The house that had been burned to the ground 20 years ago. I started to run, not toward the elevator, but toward the stairs. I needed to get down. I needed to reach the exit. But every time I turned a corner, the hallway seemed to stretch. A door on my left would suddenly appear on my right. Creak, creak. I stopped. The sound of footsteps, not mine. These were light bare feet on wood. Sarah, wait for me. I looked back. At the end of the long flickering hallway, I saw a small shape. It was Chloe. She was wearing her yellow dress, but it was soaked with black water. She was walking toward me, her head tilted at an impossible angle. And then she started to run. She didn't run like a human. She moved in short, jerky bursts like a broken film reel. One second she was 50 feet away, the next, 30. I threw myself into the stairwell. I didn't take the stairs one by one. I practically fell down them. Flights after flights. 4th floor, 3rd floor, 2nd floor. I reached the ground floor door and burst through it, expecting to see the lobby. But I was back on the 4th floor, standing right outside the dispatch room. The door was wide open. My chair was still there. The monitor was still glowing blue. And the black sludge was now covering the entire floor. A dark ocean waiting for me to step back in. I fell to my knees. The hopelessness hit me harder than the fear. There was no escape. This wasn't a building anymore. It was a memory. And I was the prisoner. I looked at the monitor one last time. A new message was blinking on the screen. Call from the well. I reached for my headset, which was lying on the floor, untouched by the sludge. I put it on. My hand was steady now. The fear had turned into a cold, hard stone in my gut. What do you want? I asked. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. A long silence followed. And then the clicking started again. Tick, tick, tick. I want you to remember what you took from me. Sarah, the voice said, no longer a whisper. It was a roar that vibrated in my brain. I want you to look inside the box. I looked down at the floor under my desk. There, sitting in the middle of the black sludge, was a small wooden box. It was covered in dirt and old roots. My breath caught. I slowly reached out, my fingers trembling, and I lifted the lid. The lid of the box creaked as I lifted it. It wasn't the sound of old wood. It was the sound of a bone snapping. A smell hit me instantly, not the rot of the forest this time, but something familiar, something that made my stomach turn. It was the scent of my mother's lavender perfume, mixed with the metallic tang of dried blood. Inside the box, there were no gold coins or old letters. There was only a single braid of hair, dark, tangled, and tied with a frayed yellow ribbon. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I knew that ribbon. I had bought it for Chloe on her 10th birthday, the day before she disappeared. You kept it, didn't you, Sarah? The voice on the headset was so clear now. It felt like it was originating from inside my own skull. You kept the only piece of me that didn't go down into the well. My memory hit me like a physical blow. That night in Blackwood Forest, we weren't just playing. We were running from something. My father had told us never to go near the Miller house, but children are drawn to darkness like moths to a flame. We had found the red door in the basement. It didn't have a handle. It didn't have a keyhole. It only had a slot, just wide enough for a small hand to reach through. I dare you, I had whispered to Chloe. She was always the brave one. She reached in. Her arm disappeared up to the elbow. She smiled at me for a second, a wide, innocent grin. And then the smile vanished. Her eyes went wide. Something on the other side had grabbed her. I didn't try to pull her out. I didn't scream for help. I saw the door start to pulse like a beating heart. And in that moment of pure blind terror, I did the unthinkable. I grabbed the braid of her hair and pulled, trying to drag her back. But the door was stronger. The hair snapped. I fell back, clutching the yellow ribbon, while the door swallowed my best friend whole. I told the police I didn't see anything. I told my parents we got lost. I buried the ribbon in that wooden box and buried the box in my soul. Until tonight. The well is lonely, Sarah, Chloe's voice whispered. It was no longer coming from the speaker. It was coming from the shadows under my desk. I looked down. The black sludge was rising. It wasn't just on the floor anymore. It was crawling up my legs, turning my skin the color of midnight. It felt heavy, so heavy. Suddenly, the phone console lit up again. Every single line started blinking at once. Line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4. The room was filled with the sound of dozens of phones ringing simultaneously. Ring, ring, ring. The noise was deafening. I tried to cover my ears, but the sound was inside me. I looked at the monitor. Each line had a name. Line 1, Chloe. Line 2, the red door. Line 3, the well. Line 4, your turn. I reached out a trembling hand and pressed the button for line 4. Silence. Total, absolute silence. Then, a voice that wasn't Chloe's, it was my own voice. But it sounded older, withered. Sarah, look at the window. I turned my head slowly. The dispatch room had no windows. It was a bunker, 3 stories underground. But as I looked at the concrete wall, the gray surface began to crack. A line of crimson paint appeared, tracing the shape of a rectangle. A door. It wasn't a hallucination. I could smell the fresh paint. I could hear the wood groaning as it materialized out of the solid wall. The red door was here, in the middle of the 911 dispatch center. The ringing stopped. The black sludge reached my waist. I couldn't move my legs. I was being anchored to the spot. The red door began to creak open, just an inch. A pale, thin hand reached out from the darkness behind the door. It wasn't a monster's hand. It was a child's hand, and it was holding something. A single muddy shoe. Chloe's shoe. You owe me a hand, Sarah, the voice whispered. Fair is fair. I tried to scream, but the black sludge crawled into my mouth, tasting of salt and old earth. My vision started to blur. The blue light of the monitor was fading. The only thing I could see was that red door opening wider and wider. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. The phone on my desk rang one more time. I looked at the caller ID. It was my mother, calling from the house I grew up in. I forced my hand to move, fighting the weight of the sludge. I pressed accept. Sarah? My mother's voice came through, sounding panicked. Sarah, honey, are you there? There's a girl on our porch. She's wearing a yellow dress. And she says she's waiting for you to come home and play. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell my mother to run, to lock the doors, to hide in the basement, anywhere but near that porch. But the black sludge was a cold, thick gag in my throat. I could feel it sliding down into my chest, heavy as lead. Sarah? Are you there? The line is so quiet. My mother's voice was trembling now. Through the phone, I could hear a faint sound in the background of her house. Click, click, click. The sound of fingernails on the wooden porch. I struggled, my muscles screaming in protest. With one final agonizing burst of strength, I spat out the black liquid and gasped for air. Mom, run! I shrieked. Don't look at her. Just get out of the house. The line went dead. No static, no dial tone. Just a void. I looked at the red door in my dispatch room. It was fully open now. The darkness inside was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was the absence of everything. No walls, no floor, just a hole in reality. Chloe, or whatever was wearing Chloe's skin, stepped out. She was no longer jerky or blurred. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace. She stopped just inches from me. I could smell the stagnant water of the well on her dress. I could see the yellow ribbon I had just taken from the box, now tied around her pale, cold wrist. She leaned in, her faceless head tilting. Even without eyes, I felt her staring into the very bottom of my soul. You think you're still in the office, Sarah? She whispered. Her voice was a chorus of 1,000 drowned children. Look at your hands. I looked down. My hands weren't human anymore. They were made of that same black, oily smoke. I wasn't being trapped by the sludge. I was becoming it. I looked around the room. The monitors, the desk, the glowing blue lights, they were all dissolving into ash. Beyond the walls of the office, there was nothing but the Blackwood forest. I was back where it all began. The office had been a lie. My life for the last 10 years had been a dream the well allowed me to have. The door is the only way back, Sarah, Chloe said, pointing toward the crimson frame. But you can't go through alone. One stays. One leaves. That was the rule of the Miller house. That has always been the rule. I looked at the door, and then I looked at the dark woods behind me. I realized that the girl on my mother's porch, that wasn't Chloe. That was the part of me I had left behind that night. The guilt, the fear, the girl who ran. To save my mother, to save my sanity, I had to stop running. I reached out and took Chloe's hand. It was ice cold, but for the first time in 15 years, the clicking sound stopped. The forest went silent. I'm sorry, I whispered. Chloe didn't answer. She just pulled me toward the red door. As I stepped over the threshold, the world didn't end. It shifted. I felt the sensation of falling through layers of water, layers of time, layers of memory. And then I opened my eyes. I was sitting in my dispatch chair. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, weak light into the room. My headset was on. The console was quiet. No black sludge. No red door. I let out a sob of relief. A dream, I choked out. It was just a nightmare. I stood up, my legs shaky, and reached for my coat. I needed to call my mother. I needed to hear her voice. But as I reached into my pocket for my phone, my fingers brushed against something cold. Something made of wood. I pulled it out. It was a small wooden box, covered in fresh, damp dirt from the forest. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. I walked out of the building into the crisp morning air. I got into my car and looked in the rearview mirror to back out of my parking spot, and that's when I saw it. In the reflection of the back seat, sitting right behind me, was a small yellow ribbon. And on the glass of the back window, written in thick red paint, were 3 words, "Welcome home, Sarah." The engine of my car was idling, a low hum that felt like the only real thing left in existence. I stared at those 3 words in the mirror, "Welcome home, Sarah," until they burned into my retinas. I didn't turn around. I knew if I looked at the back seat, the world would dissolve again. I drove. I didn't go to my mother's house. I couldn't. What if I brought the darkness with me? What if the girl in the yellow dress was just waiting for me to open the front door? Instead, I drove to the only place that felt neutral. A 24-hour diner on the edge of town called the Rusty Anchor. It was filled with truckers and late-night workers, people who lived in the light, or at least a version of it. I sat in a corner booth, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I didn't drink. The steam rose in thin, ghostly spirals. I looked at the small wooden box sitting on the table in front of me. The dirt on it was still damp. It smelled of pine needles and ancient decay. "Everything okay, hun?" I jumped, nearly knocking the coffee over. It was the waitress. A woman in her 60s with tired eyes and a name tag that read Marge. She was looking at the box with a strange expression. "Fine," I croaked. "Just a long shift." Marge leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're from the dispatch center, aren't you? The one near Blackwood?" I nodded slowly. "My brother worked there back in the 90s, she said, wiping the table with a rag that'd seen better days. "He used to talk about the ghost calls, lines that would ring with no one on the other end. He said if you listened closely enough, you could hear the trees breathing. He quit after 6 months, said the forest was trying to map his brain. I felt the air leave my lungs." "Did he ever mention a red door?" Marge stopped wiping. Her hand went still. She looked around the diner to make sure no one was listening. "He didn't just mention it, Sarah. He claimed he found it. He said the door isn't made of wood. It's made of the things we try to forget. The more you try to bury a secret, the brighter that door glows." She leaned even closer, her breath smelling of peppermint and tobacco. "He's in a sanitarium now, 2 counties over. Every morning, he asks the nurses for a bucket of white paint. He says if he can just cover the red, the girl will let him come back from the well." Marge walked away before I could ask another question. I sat there, the box staring back at me. I realized then that I wasn't the first Sarah. I wasn't the first dispatcher to be hunted. This was a cycle, a machine fueled by guilt and the deep, dark places of the American wilderness. I reached out and finally flipped the lid of the box open again. I expected the braid of hair. I expected the yellow ribbon. But the box was empty, except for a small silver mirror at the bottom. I picked it up. It was an antique, the glass slightly cracked. As I looked into it, I didn't see my own face. I saw the dispatch room. I saw the chair I had just vacated. And in the chair, wearing my headset, was Chloe. She was answering a call. She looked up at the camera, at me, and smiled. 911, what is the location of your emergency?" she said. Her voice came out of the silver mirror, clear as a bell. And then I heard the caller's voice. It was my voice. "I'm at the Rusty Anchor Diner," my voice said through the mirror. And I think I just realized that I never actually left the forest. I looked up from the mirror. The diner was gone. Marge was gone. The smell of coffee was replaced by the overwhelming scent of wet earth and pine. I was sitting on a mossy log in the middle of Blackwood Forest. The sun was gone. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky. And right in front of me, standing among the trees, was a house. A Victorian-style house with a bright, dripping red door. I wasn't the dispatcher anymore. I was the emergency. I stood before the red door. It didn't look like a piece of a house anymore. It looked like a wound in the world, a bright, jagged scar against the dark green of the pines. My feet moved forward without my permission. In this place, my body felt like a puppet, its strings held by something deep beneath the earth. I reached out. The wood was warm. It pulsed under my fingertips, a slow, heavy heartbeat that matched my own. Thump, 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 thump. As the door swung open, there was no creak, only a soft, wet sigh. I stepped inside. I expected a hallway. I expected dust and shadows. But what I saw was a library. Thousands upon thousands of shelves stretching up into an endless black ceiling. But the shelves weren't filled with books. They were filled with cassette tapes. Thousands of them, each one labeled with a date and a time. I walked to the nearest shelf. My breath hitched. 1994, 1998, 2005, I pulled one out. It was labeled October 12th, 2014, Sarah's First Lie. I didn't need a player. As soon as my skin touched the tape, the sound filled the room. It was the voice of my 10-year-old self talking to a police officer. "No, sir," my young voice said, trembling. "I don't know where Chloe went. We were just playing tag, and then she was gone." Underneath my voice, I heard a low, distorted growl. It was the sound of the red door laughing. I realized then that this house was a museum of every lie ever told in this county. Every 911 call that was ignored, every crime that was covered up, every secret that was buried in the Blackwood mud, it all ended up here, on these shelves. "Do you see now, Sarah?" I turned around. Chloe was standing by a massive desk in the center of the room. But she wasn't a child anymore. She was a woman. She was wearing my dispatch uniform. Her name tag didn't say Chloe. It said The Collector. Every time you answered a call and didn't believe the person on the other end, you added to this library, she said, her voice echoing off the infinite shelves. Every time you told yourself that the clicking on the line was just static, you gave this house another brick. She gestured to a tape on the desk. It was glowing with a faint red light. "This is the final tape, Sarah, the one you haven't recorded yet, the one where you tell the truth." I walked toward the desk, my legs feeling like lead. "The truth about what?" "About why you really let go of my hand," Chloe whispered. I stopped. The air in the room became so thick it was hard to swallow. The guilt I had spent 15 years running from was now a physical presence, a cold hand wrapping around my throat. "I didn't mean to," I sobbed. "I was scared." "Fear is just another word for choosing yourself over someone else," Chloe replied. She pushed the red tape toward me. "Record the truth, Sarah. Give the house its final piece. And maybe, just maybe, the forest will let your mother go." I looked at the tape. Then I looked at the dark exit behind me. I knew that if I spoke into that microphone, I would never leave this library. I would become just another voice on a shelf, a memory trapped in magnetic tape. But then I heard it. A faint, distant sound coming from the red tape. Click, click, click. It wasn't a monster. It was my mother's knitting needles. She was waiting for me. I picked up the microphone. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in my life, I stopped lying. I held the microphone, its cold metal surface feeling like a piece of ice against my palm. I was ready to speak, ready to let the truth pour out of me like blood from an open wound. But as I opened my mouth, the library around me began to hum. It wasn't a mechanical hum. It was the sound of thousands of voices all whispering at once, coming from the cassette tapes on the shelves. They weren't just tapes. They were prisoners. "Not yet, Sarah," Chloe whispered, her face half hidden in the shadows of the massive desk. "Before you add your voice to the collection, you must understand the weight of what we do here. You must hear the others, the ones who thought they could outrun the red door." She reached behind her and pulled a tape from a shelf that seemed to be made of bone rather than wood. She slid it into a player on the desk and pressed play. The static was loud, like the sound of rain on a tin roof. Then a man's voice broke through. He sounded terrified, out of breath. "This is Officer Miller, badge number 742, the voice gasped. I'm in the basement of the old county courthouse. I came down here to check a leak, but the stairs are gone. There's just a red door where the exit should be." I leaned in, my heart hammering. Miller, the name Marge had mentioned at the diner. The tape continued. "I can hear them," Miller whispered. "The people I couldn't save. The boy from the 1992 hit and run. The woman whose call I hung up on because I was tired. They're standing on the other side of the door. They're not angry. That's the worst part. They're just waiting." Then a sound came from the tape that made me drop the microphone. A slow rhythmic scratching, like someone was trying to dig through metal with their bare fingernails. "They're offering me a deal," Miller's voice said, now sounding strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes right before someone breaks. "They say if I take their place, if I become the new gatekeeper, they can finally go home. They say the red door needs a heart to keep it warm." A loud metallic thud echoed through the speakers. Then a scream that didn't sound human. It sounded like metal being torn apart. The tape ended with a soft final click. Chloe looked at me. Officer Miller didn't choose his mother, Sarah. He chose himself. He's the reason the black sludge follows you. He's the one who processes the calls now. He's the one who gave me your name. I looked at the endless rows of tapes. Every one of them was a life traded for another. Every one of them was a soul that had been used to keep the door warm. Is that what I am to you? I asked, my voice trembling. Just a replacement? You want me to stay here so you can finally leave the well? Chloe's expression didn't change, but for a second, I saw a flicker of the old Chloe, the girl who used to share her candy with me. The well is full, Sarah. It's overflowing. The forest is tired of hiding our sins. Either you stay and manage the library, or the red door opens for the whole town. I looked at the microphone again. My confession wouldn't just free me. It would seal me here. But if I didn't speak, if I didn't accept my guilt, the people I loved would be the next tapes on these shelves. I looked at the tape Chloe had labeled The Final Truth. Tell me about the others first, I said, my voice growing stronger. If I'm to stay here, I want to know whose stories I'm guarding. Show me the files of the Blackwood forest. Chloe smiled. It was a cold, hollow sight. She reached for another tape. Very well. Sarah, let's listen to the woman who tried to paint the forest white. Chloe's cold fingers slid the next tape into the player. The label on this one was different. It wasn't a name, but a title. The Canvas of Bone. The recording started with the sound of a heavy brush dripping with liquid, drip, splat, drip. Then a woman's voice, shaky, obsessive, and high-pitched, filled the room. Day 42, the woman whispered. The green is too loud. Every time I look at the pine needles, I see the eyes of the things that live beneath them. I've tried to ignore them. I've tried to paint over them with oils and acrylics. But the forest, it eats the color. It swallows the blues and the yellows and leaves only the dark. I listened, mesmerized, as the woman's story unfolded. Her name was Eleanor, a world-class painter who had moved to a cabin near Blackwood to find inspiration. But she had found something else. I realized yesterday, Eleanor's voice continued, a manic laugh bubbling in her throat, that the only way to silence the forest is to make it pure white, like a blank canvas. I bought 40 gallons of white lead paint. I started with the oak tree near my porch. I painted every leaf, every inch of bark, and for a moment, it was quiet. The sound of the brush on the tape became more frantic. Scrape, scrape, scrape. But the trees started screaming, Sarah, Eleanor said, addressing the tape as if she knew who would eventually hear it. Not a sound you hear with your ears, but a vibration in your teeth. They didn't like being covered. They started to grow through the paint, but the growth was wrong. The branches didn't grow toward the sun. They grew toward my windows. They grew in the shape of human fingers reaching for the glass. I looked at Chloe, but she remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the spinning reels of the tape. I'm out of white paint now. Eleanor's voice dropped to a terrifyingly calm level, but I found a new source. It's inside me, underneath the skin. It's white and hard and perfect. I just need a sharp enough knife to reach the bone. If I can't paint the forest white, I'll pave it with my own skeleton. I'll be the foundation of the new silent world. The tape was filled with a sudden, wet, tearing sound. Then silence. Not the silence of a finished recording, but the silence of a forest that had just been fed. She's still out there, Sarah, Chloe said, clicking the player off. If you wander deep enough into the northern part of Blackwood, you'll find a patch of trees that are as white as bleached ivory. They don't have leaves. They have teeth. And Eleanor is the heart of that grove, still trying to paint the world into a grave. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. These weren't just stories. They were warnings. The library was a map of all the ways a soul can be broken by this place. Why are you showing me this? I asked, my voice cracking. Because you think your guilt is special, Sarah, Chloe replied, leaning over the desk until her face was inches from mine. You think letting go of my hand was the worst thing that ever happened here. But look around you. This room is full of people who did much worse to survive. And yet, the red door still wants you. You aren't just another tape. You're the one who's supposed to close the book. Chloe reached for a third tape, but this one didn't come from the shelves. It was hidden inside a drawer in the desk. It was wrapped in barbed wire. This, Chloe whispered, is the story of the man who built the red door. And if you hear this, Sarah, there is no going back. Not for you, not for your mother, and not for the girl in the yellow dress. I stared at the barbed wire, my heart pounding like a trapped bird. I knew I should stop. I knew I should run. But in this library, curiosity was more powerful than fear. Chloe's hands trembled slightly as she began to untangle the barbed wire from the tape. The metal scratched against the desk, a harsh, screeching sound that felt like it was peeling away layers of my own skin. The man who built the door didn't have a name that history remembers, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a low, rhythmic chant. In the town records, he was just a carpenter, a man who lost his wife to the fever and his daughter to the cold. He was a man who decided that death was just a wall, and he was going to build a door through it. She snapped the last of the wire and pushed the tape into the player. The sound that came out wasn't static. It was the sound of a hammer hitting a nail, clang, 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 but the hits were slow, deliberate, and followed by a sound like a wet sponge being squeezed. "I have gathered the materials," a man's voice began. It was deep, gravelly, and carried a weight of sorrow that felt like a physical pressure in the room. "The wood is from the heart of the Blackwood pines, trees that have never seen the sun. The nails are forged from the iron of a graveyard fence. But a door is not just wood and metal. A door is an invitation." I leaned closer, my eyes fixed on the spinning reels. "I realized," the carpenter's voice continued, "that for a door to open into the other side, it must be painted with the color of life. But not just any life. It must be the life of the innocent. I spent 40 nights in the basement of my house carving the frame. Every splinter that pierced my skin was a prayer. Every drop of my own blood was a promise." The hammer sound stopped. Silence. "On the 41st night," the man whispered, "the door was finished. It was beautiful. A deep, pulsing crimson. I stood before it, and I whispered my daughter's name. I waited for her to walk through. I waited for the cold to be over. But the door didn't bring her back. Instead, it asked for a toll." A loud, splintering sound erupted from the tape, followed by a scream so full of agony that I felt my own throat tighten in sympathy. "The door didn't open to the heaven I imagined," the carpenter sobbed. "It opened to a hunger. It reached out with wooden fingers and took my eyes. It took my voice. It took my memory of her face. It told me that a door works both ways. It lets things in, and it keeps things out. And now I am the hinge. I am the wood. I am the very thing I built." The tape ended with the sound of wind, a howling, unnatural wind that seemed to blow right out of the speakers and into the library, flickering the candles. Chloe looked at me, her face pale in the dying light. "He's still there, Sarah, underneath the Miller house. He is the one who holds the handle from the other side. When you let go of my hand, it wasn't the well that took me. It was him. He needed a new daughter. He needed someone to keep the wood warm." I backed away from the desk, the horror of it finally breaking through my resolve. So this whole library, the dispatch center, the forest, it's all just a way to feed that door? "It's a system, Sarah," Chloe said, standing up. The shadows behind her grew tall and jagged, taking the shape of twisted branches. "The carpenter needs stories. He needs guilt. He needs the black sludge to keep the hinges greased. And tonight, he's hungry for a story that has been 15 years in the making." She pointed to the microphone I was still holding. "Your mother is at the porch, Sarah. The carpenter is at the door. And the tape is waiting. Tell us, why did you really let go?" I looked at the microphone. I knew that the truth I had been telling myself was a lie. I didn't just run because I was scared. There was something else, something darker that I had hidden even from my own mind. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice was a ghost of itself. I let go because I wanted to see what was inside. As soon as the words left my mouth, the library began to shake. The shelves groaned, and thousands of cassette tapes began to spill onto the floor like a waterfall of plastic and secrets. The library was no longer a place of silent shelves. It was a dying beast. Cassette tapes exploded like firecrackers, the black magnetic ribbons unspooling and coiling around my ankles like snakes. The floorboards groaned, buckling upward as if something massive was trying to breathe beneath them. Chloe stood behind the desk, her form flickering between the girl I knew and a silhouette of jagged shadows. "The truth is a key, Sarah," she screamed over the roar of the collapsing room. "But once you turn it, you can't take it back." I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, but the red door was the only thing that remained standing amidst the chaos. I lunged through it, expecting to feel the cold air of the forest. Instead, I fell. I hit a hard, wooden floor with a thud that knocked the air out of my lungs. I scrambled to my feet, gasping, and looked around. I wasn't in the library. I wasn't in the dispatch center. I was in a workshop. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and fresh blood. Everywhere I looked, there were tools, saws with rusted teeth, hammers stained dark, and wood shavings that looked like curls of human skin. And in the center of the room sat the carpenter. He was taller than any man should be, his limbs long and thin, like the branches of a winter tree. He was hunched over a workbench, his back to me. He didn't have a shirt on, and I could see that his skin was etched with thousands of names. I saw Miller. I saw Eleanor. And right between his shoulder blades, I saw a fresh mark, the skin still raw and red. It said Sarah. The carpenter didn't turn around, but the sound of his voice vibrated through the floorboards into the soles of my feet. You wanted to see what was inside, little moth. You let go of the hand because the darkness was more beautiful than the friend. He slowly stood up. The sound of his joints cracking was like dry wood snapping in a fire. He turned his head, not his body, just his head, 180 degrees to face me. His face was a mask of unfinished cedar. No eyes, no nose. Just a mouth carved into a permanent jagged grin. I am the hinge, he whispered, and the sound came from the walls, the floor and the ceiling all at once. And you are the new wood. You will be the grain. You will be the splinters. You will be the reason the next Sarah screams. He reached out a long wooden hand, his fingers elongated, stretching across the room like vines. I backed away, but my heel caught on a pile of wood shavings. I fell. The black sludge started to pour from his fingertips, flooding the workshop. It wasn't just oil anymore. It was thick, warm, and smelled of every lie I had ever told. It covered my legs, my waist, my chest. Don't fight it, the carpenter urged. The red door needs to be painted, and your blood has just the right shade of guilt. Just as his wooden fingers were about to touch my throat, the phone in my pocket, the one that shouldn't have been there, the one from the dispatch center, vibrated. I pulled it out with a shaking hand. The screen was cracked, but I could see the caller. Call from Chloe. I pressed answer. Sarah. Chloe's voice was a frantic whisper. The carpenter is the hinge. But the hinge can be broken. Look under the workbench. The iron nails. The graveyard iron. I didn't think. I dived under the heavy wooden bench just as the carpenter's hand smashed into the wall where my head had been. My fingers clawed through the sawdust until they hit something cold, hard. A box of iron nails, forged from a graveyard fence. I grabbed a handful. The metal burned my skin, smelling of ozone and old earth. I looked up at the carpenter. He was looming over me, his wooden mouth opening wide to reveal a void of absolute darkness. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I took the longest nail and drove it straight into the wooden floor, right through the black sludge. The effect was instantaneous. A sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering filled the workshop. The carpenter let out a hollow wooden roar. The names on his back began to glow with a sickly white light. The world started to tilt. The workshop was dissolving, the wood turning into smoke, the smell of sawdust replaced by the biting cold of the Blackwood forest. I felt myself falling again. But this time, I wasn't falling into the dark. I was falling toward a light. A small, flickering light at the end of a long, metallic tunnel. The sound of my own breathing returned. The hum of a server rack. The smell of stale coffee. I opened my eyes. I was sitting at my console. The clock on the screen said 3:12 a.m. The snow was still falling outside. I looked at my hands. They were covered in sawdust. And in my palm, I was still clutching a single rusted iron nail. Line 4 began to blink. I didn't answer it. I stood up, walked to the server room, and pulled the master switch. The dispatch center went dark. For the first time in 10 years, the voices were silent. I walked out into the snow, the iron nail still gripped in my hand. I didn't go home. I didn't go to my mother's. I walked toward the forest. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the hunter. And I had a box of nails to finish. The snow didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like ash. I walked past the boundary of the parking lot. The crunch of my boots on the frozen ground, the only sound in the world. In my right hand, the iron nail felt warm, almost vibrating. It was as if the metal was thirsty for the wood it was meant to pierce. I didn't need a map. The forest itself was pulling me in, the trees leaning toward me like skeletal fans. I could hear them whispering, not my name this time, but a warning. The hinge is broken, but the door remains. The carpenter is wounded, but the house is hungry. I reached the spot where Chloe and I had played 15 years ago. The whispering well was still there, but it looked different. The stones were covered in a thick, black moss that seemed to pulsate with a rhythmic beat. Thump, 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 thump. I stood at the edge and looked down. I didn't see water. I saw a reflection of the night sky, but the stars were red. And in the center of that red galaxy, I saw the carpenter's face. He was staring back at me from the depths of the earth. You think a single nail can stop an ancient hunger, Sarah? The voice didn't come from the well. It came from the trees behind me. I turned around slowly. Standing there was a man, or what used to be a man. He was wearing a tattered park ranger's uniform from the 80s. His skin was the color of old parchment, and where his eyes should have been, there were only 2 perfectly round holes, filled with glowing white moths. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the terror rising in my gut. "I am the one who failed before you," he whispered, the moths in his eyes fluttering. "I am Ranger Vance. I spent 20 years trying to nail the red door shut. I thought I was the hunter too, but you cannot hunt a shadow with iron alone." He stepped closer, and I saw that his hands were fused into the shape of wooden claws. "The carpenter is just a servant, Sarah. He is the one who builds the cages. But the thing that lives inside the cages, that is what you should fear." He pointed a clawed finger toward the deepest part of the forest, a place where the trees grew so close together they looked like a solid wall of black. "There is a second door, not red, not wood, a door made of glass and bone. That is where they are keeping the real Chloe." My heart stopped. "The real Chloe? Then who is in the library?" Vance let out a sound like dry leaves rustling. "A copy, a memory made of black sludge and guilt. The forest feeds on your regrets, Sarah. It creates mirrors of the people you lost to keep you trapped in the loop. If you want to end this, you have to go to the glass door, but be warned. Glass doesn't just show you the truth. It shatters it." He handed me something. It was a small, rusted lantern, but instead of a candle, it contained one of those glowing white moths. "Follow the light, and whatever you do, do not look at your own reflection in the glass door. If you see yourself, you become part of the glass." As soon as I took the lantern, Vance began to dissolve. Not into smoke, but into thousands of white moths that flew up into the dark canopy. I was alone again, the iron nail in one hand, the moth lantern in the other. I started walking toward the wall of black trees. The moth in the lantern began to beat its wings faster, the light turning from white to a pale, sickly violet. As I pushed through the first layer of branches, the world changed. The snow disappeared, the ground turned into soft gray sand, and the trees were no longer made of wood. They were made of mirrors. Every trunk, every branch, every twig was a shard of glass, and as I walked past them, I saw 1,000 versions of myself. Sarah the dispatcher, Sarah the child, Sarah the coward, Sarah the hunter. They were all staring at me, and they were all starting to scream. The forest of glass was not a place. It was a punishment. Every step I took was echoed by 1,000 reflections, and every reflection was a version of me I had tried to forget. In one shard, I saw the 10-year-old girl paralyzed with fear. In another, I saw the cold dispatcher who had filed away cries for help as mere statistics, to keep her own sanity intact. I looked down, but the very ground was made of mirrors. My own eyes stared back at me from beneath my boots, judging every step. Suddenly, a sharp, crystalline sound pierced the air. Tink, like a massive mirror shattering under pressure. From a tree made of obsidian glass, a figure stepped out. She looked exactly like me, the same uniform, the same hair, the same tired face. But she had no eyes, where they should have been. There were only jagged shards of silver glass that caught the violet light of my lantern. "Why are you here, Sarah?" my doppelganger asked. Her voice was my own, but it sounded metallic, devoid of any human warmth. "Are you here to save Chloe? Or are you just here to unload the guilt you've been carrying like a stone?" I gripped the moth lantern tighter. The violet glow made the creature flinch, her glass skin shimmering with unease. "I'm here for the truth," I shouted, my voice cracking the unnatural silence. "I'm here to end the loop." She laughed, a sound like fingernails scraping against a window pane. "The loop is inside you, Sarah. The forest is just the projection. Look at what you really did that night." She pointed toward a massive, curved mirror embedded in the center of the grove. The scene inside shifted. It was that night at the Blackwood well, but the perspective was different. I saw Chloe's hand reaching out, begging for help. I saw myself grabbing her hand. But then, a voice whispered from the depths of the well, a promise of peace and freedom if I just let go. In the reflection, I didn't let go because I was scared. I let go because I wanted to be free of the burden of being her protector. My head spun. Was that the real memory? Was I that selfish? "Your iron nail won't work here," the doppelganger hissed, stepping closer. Her fingers were sharp as razors. "In this place, only those who embrace their shadows survive. Come, step into the glass. No more shifts. No more guilt. Just the cold, perfect silence." She reached for me, her glass-tipped fingers inches from my throat. My moth lantern began to beat its wings violently, the light expanding until the entire world turned a blinding, holy white. I remembered Ranger Vance's warning, "The glass doesn't show the truth. It shatters it." I closed my eyes and screamed, "This isn't my truth! It's the forest trap!" I took the iron nail and, with every ounce of strength I had left, I slammed it into the glass floor beneath my feet. Crack! The entire forest shivered. One by one, the glass trees began to tilt and shatter into millions of tiny diamonds. My doppelganger shrieked, her body dissolving into a cloud of silver dust. A sudden vortex of wind lifted me off the ground, spinning me into a dark abyss. When I opened my eyes, the glass was gone. The snow was gone. I was standing before a door made of calcified bone and transparent crystal. The glass door, and through it, I could finally see Chloe, but she wasn't a girl anymore. She was sitting in a chair, her body as clear as water, with black ink pulsing through her veins like a dark, rhythmic tide. I stood before the glass door, and the silence was more terrifying than any scream. The frame, made of calcified bone, felt warm to the touch, as if the ribs were still part of a living thing. On the other side, Chloe sat perfectly still. The black ink in her veins, the distilled essence of every unanswered. 911 call pulsed in time with the flickering violet light of my lantern. I reached out, my fingers trembling. The glass didn't feel like glass. It felt like frozen air. "Chloe," I whispered, "I'm here to finish it. I'm here to take you home." She didn't move her head, but her voice echoed inside my mind, cold and liquid. "Home is a story we tell ourselves to ignore the dark, Sarah. Look at me. I am no longer a girl. I am the archive. I am the weight of everything you couldn't save." As she spoke, the black ink in her arm began to leak through her pores, crawling up the back of her chair like living shadows. "The carpenter didn't just take me," she continued. "He hollowed me out. He used me to store the calls that the world wanted to forget. Every time you hung up on a prank that was actually a scream, it came to me. I am full, Sarah, and when the archive is full, the door must open." I saw a crack appear on the glass door. Not a small one, a jagged lightning bolt that sliced through the reflection of my own face. From the crack, a thin trail of that black ink began to seep toward my feet. "There's an iron nail in the forest, Chloe," I yelled, desperate. "I can seal the carpenter away. I can break the hinge." Chloe finally turned her head. Her face was a void of transparent crystal. "The carpenter is not the master, Sarah. He is the servant. The door is the master. It was here before the town, before the forest, before the first lie was ever told. It doesn't want a soul. It wants a witness." Suddenly, the floor beneath me turned into a whirlpool of sawdust and bone. The scent of fresh-cut cedar filled the air, the signature of the carpenter. I felt a heavy wooden hand clamp down on my shoulder. The strength was immense, the fingers long and splintered. "You've seen too much of the blueprint, little dispatcher," the carpenter's voice rumbled, sounding like two massive logs grinding together. "The archive needs a new vessel. Chloe is fading. Her glass is brittle. But your guilt is fresh. Your blood is warm. You are the perfect ink." He began to pull me away from the glass door, dragging me back toward the darkness of the workshop. I kicked and clawed at the ground, but my fingers only found loose gray sand. "Chloe, help me!" I screamed. For a split second, the black ink in her eyes cleared. She stood up, her transparent body glowing with a sudden, fierce white light. She pressed her hands against the other side of the glass, right where the crack was widening. "The price of the door is a life for a life," she whispered, her voice finally sounding like my best friend again. "But the price of the truth is a secret for a secret." She shoved her hand through the crack in the glass. The shards sliced into her transparent skin, but she didn't bleed red. She bled black. She reached out and grabbed my hand, her grip colder than the grave. "Tell the door the secret you never told the police. Sarah, tell it the one thing that will make the carpenter tremble." I looked at the carpenter's featureless cedar face. I looked at the bone frame of the door. I knew what I had to say. It was the one secret I had even kept from myself. "I didn't just let go of your hand. Chloe," I sobbed, the words tearing out of my chest. "I'm the one who led us to the Miller house. I wanted to find the door. I wanted to see if the stories were true. I traded you for a story." The moment the words left my lips, the world didn't just stop, it curdled. The carpenter's grip on my shoulder loosened, not out of mercy, but out of a sudden, vibrating shock. Even a monster built of wood and ancient grudges wasn't prepared for a truth that ugly. I had traded my best friend for a ghost story, and now the ghost story was eating us both alive. The glass door didn't shatter, it inhaled. The black ink leaking from Chloe's veins suddenly reversed direction, turning into a violent vacuum. It sucked the air out of the room, pulling at the sawdust, the bone frame, and the carpenter himself. He let out a sound like a forest groaning under a hurricane, his wooden heels digging into the gray sand, trying to resist the pull of the very door he served. "You cursed child!" the carpenter roared, his cedar face cracking open down the middle to reveal a throat lined with rusted teeth. "You aren't a victim. You are the architect. You brought the hunger here." Chloe was pressed against the glass from the other side, her transparent face distorted by the pressure. "The secret is out, Sarah. The door knows who turned the handle. Use the iron now." I looked down. The iron nail I had dropped was glowing with a blinding white-hot intensity. It wasn't just metal anymore. It was a lightning rod for the truth I had finally admitted. I lunged for it, my fingers searing as I gripped the red-hot iron. I didn't aim for the carpenter. I aimed for the center of the glass door, right where my own reflection was screaming. "I am the one who opens." I shrieked, driving the iron nail into the crack. Crack boom. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of 1,000 years of silence being broken at once. The glass door exploded into dust, not shards, but a fine stinging powder that filled the air. The vacuum vanished, replaced by a wall of absolute, freezing darkness that rushed out from the other side. The carpenter was the first to go. Without the door to anchor him, his wooden body began to splinter and fray. The names on his back, Miller, Eleanor, Vance, flew off his skin like dead leaves in a gale. He didn't scream. He simply dissolved into sawdust, his jagged grin the last thing to vanish into the dark. Then came the voices, millions of them. The archive was open. Every 911 call, every ignored plea, every whispered secret that Chloe had been forced to hold poured out into the Blackwood forest. "Help me. He's in the house. Please, I didn't mean to. It's so cold." I covered my ears, rolling on the sand, but the voices were inside my blood. I felt a hand on my head, a soft, warm hand. Not glass, not wood. I looked up. Chloe was kneeling beside me. She wasn't transparent anymore. She was 10 years old again, wearing her yellow dress. And for the first time in 15 years, her eyes weren't empty. They were bright brown and filled with tears. "You did it, Sarah," she whispered. "The library is gone. The hinge is broken. Are we going home?" I sobbed, reaching for her. Chloe smiled, but it was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. "I can't go where you're going." "Sarah, I've been part of the wood for too long. But the door is closed. No one else has to stay." She stood up and began to walk toward the light. As she moved, she began to fade, her form becoming part of the morning mist. "Wait!" I yelled. "What about the carpenter? What about the others?" Chloe's voice came back to me on the wind, faint and distant. "The forest is just a forest now, Sarah. But remember, some doors don't need wood or glass. Some doors are just waiting for someone to tell a lie." I blinked and the mist swallowed her. I was lying in the middle of a clearing. The snow was gone. The Whispering Well was just a pile of old dry stones. I stood up and walked toward the road. My car was sitting exactly where I had left it, the engine still warm. I got in and looked in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. I drove home in silence. I walked up to my mother's porch, my heart in my throat. I opened the door, and there she was, sitting in her chair, knitting. "Long shift, honey?" she asked. I sat down on the floor at her feet and leaned my head against her knees. "Mom, I need to tell you what happened 15 years ago." My mother stopped knitting. She looked down at me, and for a second her eyes turned a cold, transparent silver. "I know, Sarah," she whispered. "The carpenter told me you were coming." The sound of the knitting, needles hitting the floor, was the only thing that broke the silence. Click, clack, thud. My mother didn't reach down to pick them up. She just stared at me with those silver, liquid eyes that didn't belong to the woman who had raised me, but to the archive I thought I had destroyed. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I tried to pull away, but my limbs felt like they were made of lead. "The forest doesn't disappear just because you stop looking at it, Sarah," she said. Her voice was her own, but it was layered with the gravelly resonance of the carpenter. "You broke the red door, yes, but a house has many doors. A life has many entrances." She stood up, and as she did, the walls of the living room began to stretch. The familiar floral wallpaper started to peel, revealing not wood or plaster, but rows of black magnetic tape, unspooling like the guts of a dying machine. The scent of lavender perfume vanished, replaced by the suffocating smell of sawdust and stagnant well water. "You thought you were the hero of the story." She continued, walking toward the kitchen. "But the carpenter doesn't build cages for his enemies. He builds them for his successors." Chloe held the weight for 15 years. Now the weight has a new home. I scrambled to my feet, backing toward the front door. But as I grabbed the handle, it turned into soft, rotting bark in my hand. The door wouldn't budge. It wasn't a door anymore. It was part of a tree. "Look at the clock, Sarah," my mother called out from the kitchen. I looked at the grandfather clock in the hallway. The pendulum wasn't swinging. The hands were spinning wildly, clockwise, then counterclockwise, before snapping to a stop at 3:12 a.m. The exact time I had pulled the master switch at the dispatch center. "You never left the chair," a voice whispered from the shadows behind the couch. I turned and my heart nearly stopped. Sitting on our sofa was Ranger Vance, his moth-filled eyes glowing in the dim light. Beside him sat Eleanor, her skin pale and white as bone, her fingers still stained with the lead paint she had used to try and silence the woods. "We are the residents of the new library," Vance said, his voice rustling like dead leaves. "And you, Sarah, you are the head librarian." The floor beneath me began to liquefy, turning into that familiar black sludge. I realized then that the victory in the forest was just another layer of the trap. The carpenter hadn't been defeated. He had been recycled. My mother walked back into the room holding a tray, but there was no tea on it. There was only a single rusted iron nail and a yellow ribbon. "Answer the phone, Sarah," she said, pointing to the end table. There was no phone there. But then the air began to vibrate. A high-pitched ringing sound erupted from inside my own chest. It was the 911 console. I could feel the buttons glowing under my skin. I fell to my knees, clutching my stomach as the ringing became deafening. I felt a cold wooden hand settle on my head. 901, my mother whispered, leaning down until her silver eyes were all I could see. "What is the location of your emergency?" I opened my mouth to scream, but only static came out. I looked at my hands. They were turning transparent. I could see the black ink of a million unheard cries beginning to pulse through my veins. The shift wasn't over. The 10-hour night had just become an eternity. The static in my throat felt like swallowing broken glass. Every time the ringing pulsed in my chest, my body flickered. One moment I was in my mother's living room. The next I was strapped back into the cold, ergonomic chair of the dispatch center. The reality was thinning, tearing at the seams. "Stop it!" I gasped, the black ink now reaching my throat. I ended the loop. I broke the hinge. My mother, or the thing wearing her skin, laughed, a sound like dry bones rattling in a box. "You didn't break the hinge, Sarah. You just gave it a reason to turn faster. The carpenter doesn't care who holds the nail, as long as the house stays occupied." Beside the couch, Eleanor stood up. Her white, bone-like skin began to crack, and from the fissures, more of that black magnetic tape spilled out, coiling around my wrists. "Welcome to the collection," she whispered. "You wanted to be the one who heard the truth. Now you get to hear it forever." The ringing in my chest reached a deafening crescendo. I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my palm. I looked down. The iron nail was there, but it wasn't in my hand. It was emerging from my skin, as if my own body was forging the metal to pin itself to the floor. "No," I whispered. "I'm not a librarian. I'm the one who answers." I closed my eyes, blocking out the sight of the silver-eyed woman and the moth-filled ranger. I focused on the sound, not the ringing, but the silence beneath it. I remembered the real Chloe's voice from the glass door. Some doors are just waiting for someone to tell a lie. I realized the trap. The carpenter hadn't brought me here. My own mind, unable to live with the guilt of my mother being part of the horror, had created this false home to keep me compliant. "This isn't my mother," I said, my voice growing deeper, resonant. "My mother is safe in her house. This is just a recording." I reached out and grabbed the black magnetic tape coiling around my arm. It didn't feel like plastic. It felt like a cold, slimy vein. I pulled. The room screamed. The walls of the house began to fold in on themselves like a cardboard box. My mother distorted, her face stretching into a long, wooden mask before dissolving into a cloud of sawdust. Ranger Vance and Eleanor vanished into a swarm of white moths that were instantly sucked into the spinning hands of the grandfather clock. I stood up in the center of the collapsing hallucination. I reached into my chest, where the ringing was loudest, and I didn't find a phone. I found the yellow ribbon. I pulled it out. As the ribbon emerged, it dragged with it the black ink, the sludge, and the static. It was a golden thread of pure memory, untainted by the forest. "The shift is over," I commanded. The floor beneath me vanished. I didn't fall this time. I floated. The darkness wasn't empty. It was filled with the blue light of 1,000 computer monitors. I was back in the dispatch center, but I wasn't in my chair. I was standing in the middle of the room, looking at my own body. There I sat, headset on, eyes wide, staring at a blank screen. My body looked like a statue, frozen in the moment I had pulled the master switch. And standing right behind my chair, his wooden hand hovering inches over my real shoulder, was the Carpenter. He wasn't dead. He was waiting for me to wake up so he could finish the transformation. He couldn't see me, the real Sarah, standing in the shadows. He only saw the shell I had left behind. I looked at the yellow ribbon in my hand. Then I looked at the master power breaker on the wall. "Fair is fair, you wooden bastard," I whispered. I didn't turn the power back on. I took the yellow ribbon and tied it around the main power lever, binding it in the off position. The Carpenter froze. He let out a low, mournful groan as the last of the emergency battery backup began to fail. Without the electricity, without the archive of the digital world to feed him, he had no power over my reality. He began to turn into stone. Not wood, not bone, but cold, silent stone. I walked over to my frozen body. I reached out and touched my own cheek. "Wake up," I whispered. "It's time to go home. For real this time." The building felt like a tomb. Not the kind made of stone and earth, but a modern tomb of plastic, wire, and dead air. I stood there, a ghost in my own workplace, watching my physical body sitting motionless in that chair. Behind me, the Carpenter was frozen like a grotesque statue, his wooden fingers still reaching for the girl who wasn't there anymore. The only light came from the faint dying glow of the emergency exit sign. It cast a sickly red hue over the room, the same color as the door. "You can't just leave," a voice echoed through the room. It wasn't the Carpenter. It was coming from the headsets hanging on the empty desks, hundreds of them whispering in unison. "The calls are still coming in, Sarah. Someone has to answer. If you leave, the static will follow you. It will find a new wire. It will find a new ear." I ignored the voices. I leaned over my physical self and whispered again, "Wake up." My body's eyes blinked. Slowly, the pupils focused. My physical hand reached up and touched the spot on my cheek, where my spirit had just brushed it. A shudder ran through my flesh and blood frame. I felt a sudden, violent pull, a sensation like being sucked through a straw. Gasp. I was back. The cold plastic of the headset felt like ice against my ear. The smell of stale coffee and ozone hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was in my chair. I looked behind me. The Carpenter was gone. There was no stone statue, no wooden monster. Just an empty, dark office. But as I stood up, my legs trembling, I heard it. Tuck, tuck, tuck. The sound of a keyboard. Someone was typing. I walked slowly toward the back of the room, toward the supervisor's station. The screen was on. It was the only glowing thing in the building. It shouldn't have been on. The power was dead. I had tied the lever with the yellow ribbon. I looked at the screen. A single 911 call was active. Caller ID unknown. GPS 0.00.0. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But the cursor was moving on its own, typing out the transcript of a call that was happening right now. Transcript. Caller, I see her. Dispatcher, who do you see? Caller, the girl who thinks she escaped. She's standing at the supervisor's desk. She's wearing a blue sweater. She looks tired. A chill ran down my spine that felt like a needle of ice. I was wearing a blue sweater. I slowly looked up at the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. The little red light was blinking. It was watching me. "Sarah," the screen typed out. "The forest didn't need a door to get to the city. It used the fiber optics. It used the satellites. You didn't break the hinge. You just upgraded the hardware." Suddenly, every phone in the room, dozens of them, began to ring. But they weren't ringing the standard tone. They were screaming. A high-pitched, distorted human scream that vibrated the glass in the windows. I turned and ran for the exit. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't grab my keys. I pushed through the heavy steel doors and burst out into the parking lot. The snow had stopped. The air was perfectly still. But the city wasn't right. I looked at the streetlights. They weren't glowing yellow or white. They were a deep, pulsing crimson. And as I looked down the road, I saw that the telephone poles weren't made of treated wood anymore. They had branches, long, jagged branches that reached toward each other, weaving a canopy of wires and wood over the entire street. The Blackwood forest hadn't been defeated. It had colonized the world. I reached for my car door, but the handle felt like bone. I looked into the driver's side window. Sitting in my driver's seat was my mother. She wasn't knitting. She was holding a headset. She turned to look at me, her eyes two glowing white moths. 911, she whispered through the glass. "What is the location of your emergency?" The streetlights pulsed like a dying heart, casting long rhythmic shadows across the pavement. I stood in the middle of the parking lot, frozen as the world I knew was rewritten in the language of the Blackwood. The crimson glow of the lights revealed the truth. The city was no longer made of concrete and steel. It was a skin, stretched over something ancient and hungry. I looked at my mother inside the car. Her moth-filled eyes didn't blink. She sat perfectly still, the headset cord wrapping around her neck like a parasitic vine. "You aren't my mother," I whispered, my voice swallowed by the hum of the overhead wires. "You're just another recording, another file in the archive." The car door creaked open, but my mother didn't move. Instead, the car itself began to change. The leather of the seats groaned, turning into damp moss. The dashboard cracked, silver-gray bark pushing through the plastic. Within seconds, my car was nothing more than a hollowed-out stump, and the woman inside was a sculpture of twigs and dry leaves. I backed away, stumbling into the middle of the street. The telephone poles groaned above me. The wires weren't carrying electricity anymore. They were carrying screams. I could hear them buzzing, thousands of voices vibrating through the copper, all of them asking for a location, all of them begging for help. The source, I muttered to myself. I have to find the source. If the forest had used the city's network to spread, then the heart of the infection wasn't back in the woods. It was at the center of the grid. I looked toward the downtown skyline. The massive radio tower that sat atop the tallest building was glowing. It wasn't the red of the streetlights. It was a pure, blinding violet, the same color as the moth lantern. It looked like a giant, jagged needle stitching the clouds to the earth. I started to run. The sidewalk felt soft beneath my boots, like walking on a layer of decomposed leaves. As I passed a row of houses, I saw faces in the windows. They weren't people. They were silhouettes made of static, their hands pressed against the glass, their bodies flickering like dying television sets. Every house had become a cell. Every family had become a tape. Suddenly, a sound erupted from a nearby alleyway. Thwack, thwack, thwack. I stopped, my heart racing. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Ranger Vance, but he was falling apart. His moth eyes were dim, and his wooden limbs were splintered. He was dragging a heavy axe behind him. Not an axe made of iron, but one made of solidified black sludge. "It's too late, Sarah," he wheezed, white moths fluttering weakly from his mouth. "The architect has uploaded the door. You can't nail down a signal. You can't bury a frequency. There's always a physical source, Vance." I yelled, "The tower. If I take down the tower, the signal dies." Vance let out a dry, rattling laugh. "The tower isn't the transmitter, Sarah. It's the antenna. You are the transmitter. Every memory you have of the forest, every lie you ever told, every time you hear that ringing in your chest, you are broadcasting the Blackwood to the world." He pointed the sludge axe at my heart. "To kill the forest, you have to shut down the station. And the station is you." He raised the axe, the black liquid dripping from the blade like oil. But he didn't move to strike. He stood there waiting. The carpenter didn't want a successor. Vance whispered, his voice almost sympathetic. He wanted a host. "He's already inside your mind, Sarah. He's building the red door behind your eyes. Can't you feel the splinters in your thoughts?" I felt a sharp, stinging pain in the back of my skull. I reached up and touched my neck. I didn't feel skin. I felt a small wooden handle protruding from the base of my brain. The hinge. He had installed the hinge inside me. The air around me began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache. Every time my heart beat, I felt the wooden handle at the base of my skull twitch, as if a ghostly hand were testing the lock. I wasn't just Sarah anymore. I was a living lighthouse for the damned, a biological transmitter for a nightmare that was currently rewriting reality. "I'm not the host," I spat, backing away from Vance. "I'm the one who pulls the plug." I turned and ran toward the downtown skyline. The violet light from the radio tower was so intense, now that it bleached the color, out of the world. The red streetlights flickered and died as the tower's frequency took over. As I ran, the wood city attempted to stop me. The cracked pavement rippled like water, turning into a river of black sludge. The fire hydrants burst, spraying not water, but thick, magnetic tape that tried to lasso my ankles. I jumped over a park bench that had grown teeth, my lungs burning with the scent of ozone and ancient pine. I reached the base of the tower, the Nexus. It was the city's main telecommunications hub, a spire of steel that was now encased in a shell of petrified bone and pulsing glass. Standing at the entrance was a figure I hadn't seen in years. It was the police officer from the tapes, Miller. But he wasn't a man anymore. He had become a part of the architecture. His torso fused into the metal doors. His arms stretched out like a fleshy stop sign. "The line is busy, Sarah." Miller's mouth didn't move, but the words appeared on the digital ticker tape above the door. "The world is finally listening. Why would you want to hang up now?" I didn't answer. I reached into my pocket, hoping for the iron nail, but it was gone. All I had was the yellow ribbon, the one I had used to tie the power lever. It was stained black now, heavy with the ink of the archive. "Move, Miller," I commanded, "or I'll burn this whole system down." "You can't burn what is already digital," the ticker tape scrolled. "We are the signal. We are the air. We are the silence between your thoughts." I realized Miller was right. I couldn't fight a signal with fire or iron. I had to corrupt the data. I looked at the yellow ribbon. It represented the only true thing in this entire nightmare. My love for Chloe and my genuine grief. Everything else was a lie, a construct of the forest. I stepped forward and pressed the yellow ribbon against Miller's fused chest. The black ink on the ribbon began to spread into the tower's shell. "This is the location of the emergency," I whispered, my voice echoing through the tower's internal speakers. "The emergency is me." I forced my way past Miller, his body dissolving into static as the truth of the ribbon acted like a virus in the system. I climbed the stairs, the walls around me flickering between a modern office and the damp walls of the Miller house basement. I reached the roof. The radio tower loomed above me, a jagged needle of violet energy. In the center of the tower's base, suspended in a web of copper wires and translucent veins, was a heart. It was a massive wooden heart carved from a single block of Blackwood pine. It was the Carpenter's heart, and sitting right in front of it, wearing a headset made of bone, was the version of me I had seen in the mirrors, the eyeless Sarah. "You're just in time for the final broadcast," she said, her voice coming from every speaker in the city. "The hinge is about to open, and once it does, there will be no more Sarah. There will only be the door." I felt the handle at the back of my head turn. My vision began to split. I could see the roof, and I could see the bottom of the well simultaneously. I had one chance. I didn't attack her. I ran for the wooden heart. The wooden heart pulsed with a sound like a heavy drum submerged in water. Every beat sent a ripple of violet light up the tower and out into the world. The eyeless Sarah stood up, her movements jerky, like a marionette being pulled by invisible wires. "You can't touch it," she hissed, the static around her body crackling like a forest fire. "If you destroy the heart, you destroy the archive. Every soul, every memory, every version of Chloe, gone, forever." I stopped, my fingers inches from the cold, petrified surface of the heart. The handle at the base of my skull gave another sharp click. My left eye began to see in black and white, the vision of the forest, while my right eye still saw the neon violet of the city. "Chloe is already gone," I whispered, tears blurring my human vision. She told me herself. What's left here is just a recording on a loop. A tragedy you use to keep the gears turning. I looked at the yellow ribbon in my hand. It was the only thing left that wasn't part of the system. I didn't use it to tie the heart. I used it to tie myself to the tower. I wrapped the ribbon around my wrist, and then around a jagged piece of the tower's steel frame. "If I'm the transmitter," I shouted, "then I'm the one who chooses the frequency." I didn't attack the heart. Instead, I reached back and grabbed the wooden handle protruding from my own skull. The pain was blinding, a white-hot spike driving into my consciousness. I felt the splinters digging into my brain, the Carpenter's essence fighting to stay rooted. "Sarah, stop." The eyeless doppelganger screamed, her form beginning to glitch and tear. With a final guttural scream of my own, I twisted the handle, not to open it, but to rip it out. Crunch. The sound echoed across the entire city. It wasn't just wood breaking. It was the sound of a story being rewritten. As the handle tore free, a geyser of black ink sprayed across the roof. But it didn't stay black. As soon as it hit the yellow ribbon, it turned clear, pure. The wooden heart let out a final agonizing thud and stopped. The violet light of the tower turned into a blinding white sun. I felt the tower beneath me dissolve. The eyeless Sarah vanished into a cloud of moths. The buildings, the wires, the trees with teeth, they all began to pixelate and fade like a corrupted video file. I felt myself falling through a void of absolute silence. No screams. No 911 calls, no static. Beep, beep, beep. I gasped, my lungs burning with the smell of floor wax and antiseptic. I was lying on a hospital bed. A heart monitor was chirping rhythmically beside me. The sunlight streaming through the window was warm and gold, real sunlight. A nurse rushed in, her eyes wide with shock. "Doctor, she's awake." "Patient 401 is awake." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. My hand moved instinctively to the back of my head. There was no handle, just a thick layer of surgical bandages. A man in a white coat entered the room. He looked tired but kind. "Take it easy, Sarah. You've been in a coma for 3 weeks. There was an accident at the dispatch center. A massive electrical surge. You are the only survivor. I stared at him, my mind racing. The forest. The carpenter. Chloe. The doctor sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. The police found you in the server room. You had tied yourself to the main power frame with a yellow ribbon. They say it's the only reason you weren't electrocuted when the system blew. And Chloe? I whispered. The doctor looked away. Sarah. Chloe Miller went missing 15 years ago. We found her remains last week. The electrical surge at the center somehow triggered an old alarms system in the Miller basement. The police went to check it, and they found her. You gave her back to her family, Sarah. I lay back on the pillow, a single tear rolling down my cheek. It was over. The archive was closed. But as the doctor walked toward the door, he stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. The paramedics found this clutched in your hand, he said, placing it on my bedside table. They couldn't get you to let go of it, even in the ambulance. It was a rusted iron nail. And as the doctor left the room, the heart monitor beside my bed skipped a beat. For a split second, the steady beep, beep changed. It sounded like a phone ringing. I looked at the iron nail. Small green pine needles were beginning to sprout from the rusted metal. I picked up the nail, and as I held it to my ear, I heard a familiar whisper from the shadows of the hospital room. 911, what is the location of your emergency? I didn't scream. I just closed my eyes and smiled. Everywhere, I whispered. The emergency is everywhere. The screen went black. The only sound left was the wind howling through a forest that was no longer there. Or perhaps was just waiting for the next call. The hospital room was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt heavy. Like the air inside a coffin, I sat in my bed staring at the iron nail. The green pine needles sprouting from the rust were soft, but when I touched them, they felt like human hair. I realized then that the doctor was wrong. I hadn't survived the surge because of the ribbon. I had survived because the archive wasn't finished with me. It didn't want my death. It wanted my witness. I looked at the television mounted on the wall. It was turned off, a blank black rectangle of plastic and glass. But as I stared, a face began to form in the reflection. It wasn't mine. It was a man I had never met. A man wearing a headset in a dispatch center halfway across the country. He looked terrified. His hands were shaking as he typed on his keyboard. 911, what is your emergency? The man's voice whispered, not from the TV, but from the vent in the ceiling. I closed my eyes, but the image stayed. I could see his screen. I could see the caller ID. Caller ID, Sarah Blackwood. I wasn't calling him. My body was here in this bed. But a version of me, the one I had left behind in the static, was now the one making the calls. I was no longer the dispatcher. I had become the emergency. I stood up, my legs weak, and walked to the window. The city looked normal. Cars were moving, people were walking their dogs, and the sun was setting behind the skyscrapers. But I saw the truth in the shadows. Every shadow cast by a building was shaped like a pine tree. Every crack in the sidewalk was a root waiting to break through. The world was just a thin layer of paint over the canvas of bone. I looked down at the street and saw a little girl standing on the sidewalk, looking up at my window. She was wearing a yellow dress. She wasn't fading. She wasn't transparent. She looked as real as the bricks of the hospital. She raised her hand and pointed toward the horizon, where a new radio tower was being constructed. I understood then. The Carpenter was just one builder. There were others. There were architects of glass, engineers of bone, and surveyors of the void. The Blackwood wasn't a forest. It was a blueprint for a new world, a world where every secret is recorded. Every lie is archived, and no one ever truly dies. They just become part of the signal. I picked up the iron nail and tucked it into the pocket of my hospital gown. The heart monitor behind me began to flatline, a long, continuous tone. But I didn't feel my heart stop. I felt it synchronize. I walked toward the door. I didn't need a key. I didn't need permission. As I touched the handle, the hospital hallway dissolved into a trail of white moths. I wasn't going home. I was going to find the other dispatchers. I was going to find the others who had heard the ringing in their chests. The shift was over, but the war for the airwaves had just begun. As I stepped into the hallway, the intercom system crackled to life across the entire hospital. It wasn't a page for a doctor. It was a recording of a girl's laughter. Chloe's laughter, followed by a dial tone that sounded like a funeral march. The screen fades to a final, static-filled image of the Blackwood Dispatch Center, now overgrown with trees that have human eyes for leaves. The iron nail in my pocket began to vibrate against my leg. a dull hum that matched the frequency of the hospital's power grid. I wasn't just Sarah anymore. I was a living compass, and the needle was pointing toward the heart of the city. I walked out of the hospital, my gown replaced by a dark coat I had found in a staff closet. No one tried to stop me. To them, I was just a shadow, a glitch in the security cameras that blurred whenever I passed by. The first node was 1,000 miles away, but in this new reality, distance was a lie told by old maps. I stepped into the hospital elevator and pressed the button for the basement. But when the doors opened, I wasn't in the laundry room. I was standing on a subway platform in Chicago. The air was frigid, smelling of ozone and rotting wood. The commuters around me were like the ones I had seen through the windows, flickering, translucent, their eyes glued to their smartphones. They didn't see me, but they were all connected to the same source. Correct. The arrival of the train sounded like a giant branch snapping. The subway car pulled up, but it wasn't made of steel. It was a hollowed-out log, its windows made of the same bone glass I had seen in the forest. I stepped inside. The passengers were all holding their phones, but the screens weren't showing social media. They were all showing a live feed of the Blackwood well. "You're the new one, aren't you?" A voice came from the corner of the car. A young man sat there, his skin covered in a network of glowing blue veins that looked like fiber optic cables. He was holding a headset that looked like it was grown from coral. "I'm Leo," he whispered. "I was a dispatcher in Sector 7 before the frequencies merged. I thought I was the only one who could still see the sky." "What is this place, Leo?" I asked, sitting across from him. "This is the central nervous system," Leo said, pointing to the ceiling of the subway car, which was lined with pulsating red wires. The forest realized it didn't need trees to grow. It needed data. It's using the city's subway lines as roots. Every person on this train is being drained of their memories to feed the archive. By the time we reach the loop, they'll just be empty husks. He leaned in closer, his blue veins flashing. "There's a call coming in, Sarah. A big one. It's coming from the Willis Tower. Someone found an old analog phone, a line that the forest hasn't corrupted yet. If we can answer it, we can create a firewall." Suddenly, the subway car screeched to a halt. The lights flickered and turned crimson. Thump, thump, thump. Something was walking on the roof of the train. Something heavy, something with wooden claws. "The inspectors are here," Leo whispered, his face pale. "They can smell the yellow ribbon on you, Sarah. Hide the nail. Now." The screeching on the roof of the subway car sounded like a chainsaw cutting through dry bone. Leo grabbed my arm, his glowing blue veins pulsing frantically. "Don't look up, Sarah. Whatever you do, don't look at the ceiling," he hissed. But I could already see the wood rot spreading. The metal panels of the subway car were warping, turning into rough, dark bark. Long needle-like splinters began to poke through the ceiling, dripping with the same black sludge I had seen in Blackwood. These weren't just monsters. They were the inspectors, the enforcers of the new digital forest. "Why are they here?" I whispered, clutching the iron nail inside my pocket. "Because of me," Leo said, his voice cracking. "I was the one who tried to build the firewall in Chicago. I thought I could outsmart the signal. Let me tell you how it started, Sarah. Maybe then you'll understand why we can't just run." Leo leaned back, his eyes glazing over as he shared his tape. A memory so vivid it felt like we were both inside it. Leo's story. I was working the night shift at the Chicago Transit Authority, CTA, monitoring station. It was a storm just like tonight, but with lightning that turned the sky purple. I started seeing things on the CCTV, passengers on the platforms who didn't have shadows. They would stand at the edge of the tracks, staring into the dark tunnels, and then they would simply dissolve into static. I thought it was a glitch. But then a call came through on the emergency line. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a forest, wind through leaves, the snap of a twig. And then a woman's voice whispered, "The train is late because the roots are deep." I looked at the tracking map. Every train on the blue line had stopped, not because of power failure, but because the tracks were being overwritten. I watched the cameras in horror as the steel rails turned into massive, winding roots. The trains weren't moving on electricity anymore. They were being pulled by the forest. I tried to hit the emergency kill switch, but the console bit me. The wires jumped out of the panel and burrowed into my skin, right here. He pointed to the blue glowing veins on his neck. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted to use my brain as a processor. I watched my entire city turn into a garden of glass and bone through the monitors, and I couldn't even scream. Back to the subway. Suddenly, a massive wooden claw punched through the ceiling of our car, inches from Leo's head. It was followed by a face, or a lack of one. The inspector had no eyes, just a glowing red scanner where its forehead should be. It scanned the passengers, its red light passing over their flickering, static-filled bodies. It stopped at me. The scanner turned from red to a violent, pulsing violet. The transmitter has been located. A voice boomed, a distorted, mechanical version of my own voice. "Run, Sarah!" Leo yelled, shoving me toward the door at the end of the car. The Willis Tower is the only place left with an analog shield. If you reach the top, you can broadcast the reset signal. I dived through the sliding doors just as the inspector's claw crushed the seat I had been sitting on. I ran into the next car, but it wasn't a subway car anymore. It was a tunnel of mirrors. Thousands of Sarahs looked back at me, all of them screaming. But in one of the mirrors, I didn't see myself. I saw Chloe. She was standing in a field of yellow flowers, and she was holding a telephone. "Pick up, Sarah," she whispered through the glass. "The world is calling." I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the end of the train and realized we were no longer underground. The train was climbing. It was ascending the side of the Willis Tower, the tracks spiraling up the glass exterior of the skyscraper like a vine climbing a trellis. Below me, Chicago was a sea of red streetlights and shifting shadows. Above me, the violet storm was raging, the clouds forming the shape of a giant, wooden hand reaching down from the stars. I had to reach the top. I had to end the transmission. But as I climbed onto the roof of the moving train, the carpenter was waiting for me. He wasn't made of cedar anymore. He was made of fiber optic cables and rusted iron. He was the digital architect now. The wind at the top of the Willis Tower didn't feel like wind. It felt like a chorus of a billion voices, all screaming at a frequency that made my skin itch. I pulled myself onto the roof, the cold glass of the skyscraper slick with the black rain of the forest. The digital architect, the thing that used to be the carpenter, loomed. Over the edge of the spire, he was no longer a man-shaped monster. He was a pulsating mass of glowing blue wires and jagged cedar planks, his form constantly shifting, glitching between reality and code. "You're late for your shift, Sarah," the architect boomed. His voice didn't come from his throat. It erupted from the speakers built into the tower's walls. "The world is already mapped. Every soul is indexed. You are fighting for a planet that has already been deleted. Then why do you still want me?" I yelled, standing my ground. I held the iron nail in one hand and the yellow ribbon in the other. "If the world is yours, why am I still a threat?" The architect's wire-covered head tilted. "Because you are the only variable I cannot predict. You are the glitch in the archive. You carry the memory of the original forest, the one that wasn't made of data, but of blood. I need your blood to stabilize the network." He lunged. A swarm of fiber optic cables shot out from his chest like silver snakes. I dived to the left, the cable smashing into the glass floor, shattering it instantly. Below us, the city of Chicago looked like a circuit board on fire. "Sarah, the panel!" I heard Leo's voice screaming from below. I looked toward the base of the massive radio antenna. There was an old, rusted metal box with a rotary dial, the analog shield Leo had mentioned. It was the only thing on the roof that wasn't glowing blue. I ran for it, but the architect slammed his wooden fist down, blocking my path. "You think a rotary dial can stop a global transmission? You are a child trying to put out a sun with a cup of water." I looked at the iron nail. It was vibrating so hard it was cutting into my palm. I realized then that I couldn't just use it to break things. I had to use it to connect things. I didn't run for the box. I ran for the architect. I jumped onto his massive shifting wires, the electricity searing my skin. I felt the hinge in the back of my head scream in protest. As the architect tried to shake me off, I drove the iron nail directly into the center of his wire-filled chest, the place where his wooden heart used to be. "This isn't a cup of water," I screamed. "This is the grounding wire." I wrapped the yellow ribbon around the nail and the other end around the tower steel lightning rod. A massive bolt of violet lightning struck the tower at that exact moment. The energy didn't hit me. It flowed through the nail, through the architect, and down into the very roots of the city. The architect shrieked, a sound of 1,000,000 hard drives crashing at once. His blue wires began to glow white-hot, then they turned into ash. The digital forest around us began to dissolve, the red streetlights below flickering back to a steady, calm yellow. But as the architect crumbled, he grabbed my throat with one last splintered hand. "If I go, the archive goes with me," he whispered, his voice fading into static. "And everyone inside it, Chloe, Vance, your mother, they will all be erased. Do it, Sarah. Be the hero who kills everyone she loves." My hand hovered over the final switch. I looked at the city, and then I looked at the void within the architect's eyes. I saw Chloe. She was smiling, but she was waving goodbye. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I pulled the lever. The sound that followed the pulling of the lever wasn't a bang. It was a vacuum. A total, absolute silence that swallowed the wind, the city, and the architect's dying screams. For a heartbeat, the world felt like a photograph that had been dipped in acid. The edges curled, the colors bleached to a blinding white, and then everything simply stopped. I felt myself falling, but there was no wind to push against my face. I was drifting through a sea of unwritten data. Floating in this white void were fragments of lives that had been archived by the forest. I saw a floating wooden chair, a broken headset, and thousands of yellow ribbons drifting like seaweed in the tide. Then I saw them, Vance, Eleanor, Miller, and Chloe. They weren't monsters anymore. They were just people. They stood in the void, their expressions peaceful, their forms slowly dissolving into white light. "You did it, Sarah," Chloe's voice drifted to me. She looked just as she did the day we went to the well. "You broke the signal. The archive is deleting." "I killed you," I sobbed, reaching out for her, but my hands passed through her like mist. "To save the world, I had to erase you." "You didn't erase us," she smiled, her form becoming almost transparent. "You just let us stop being records. You let us become memories again. Memories can't be trapped in a door. Sarah, they can only be carried by the living." One by one, they vanished. The white void began to darken, the silence replaced by a low rhythmic thumping. Thump, 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 thump. It was a heartbeat. My heartbeat. I opened my eyes. I wasn't on the roof of the Willis Tower. I wasn't in the hospital. I was sitting in my car, parked on the side of the road leading out of Blackwood. The sun was rising, a pale, honest orange bleeding over the horizon. The radio in my car was playing static. I reached out with a trembling hand and turned the dial. No voices, no screams, just the empty hiss of a dead frequency. I looked in the rearview mirror. My eyes were clear. No silver light, no moth shadows. I checked the back of my head. The skin was smooth. No hinge, no handle. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 15 years. I put the car in gear and began to drive. I passed the sign that said, "You are now leaving Blackwood." For the first time in my life, the road felt long and open. I drove for hours, heading toward the coast, away from the woods, away from the wires. I reached a small town by the ocean, a place where the air smelled of salt and the only trees were stunted palms that looked nothing like the Blackwood pines. I checked into a small motel. I took a long shower, washing the phantom scent of sawdust from my hair. I sat on the bed, watching the waves crash against the shore through the window. It was over. The forest was gone. The architect was deleted. I reached into the pocket of my coat to find my phone, wanting to call my mother, the real version of her. But my fingers touched something cold, something sharp. I pulled it out. It was a small black SIM card, but it wasn't made of plastic. It was carved from dark, polished cedar, and etched onto the surface in tiny glowing blue letters was a single word: reboot. My heart skipped a beat. The silence of the motel room suddenly felt heavy. I looked at the TV on the wall. I looked at the digital clock on the bedside table. I looked at the smartphone sitting on the nightstand. I realized then that the architect hadn't lied. You can't delete a signal that has already been received by every device on the planet. I hadn't destroyed the archive. I had just compressed it. The reset wasn't the end. It was the formatting of the hard drive. And I was the only one who held the installation key. I stared at the black cedar SIM card in the palm of my hand. It didn't just feel like wood. It felt like it was breathing. A faint, rhythmic blue glow pulsed under its surface. A heartbeat of pure data waiting for a port. I wanted to throw it into the ocean. I wanted to watch it sink into the salt and sand where no signal could ever reach it. But as I walked toward the motel balcony, my phone on the nightstand vibrated. It wasn't a call. It was a notification. Then another, and another. The sound was like a swarm of digital insects, ping, chirp, buzz. I turned around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The TV screen flickered to life, showing nothing but a sea of rolling white static. But within the noise, a shape began to form, a silhouette of a forest made of green and red pixels. I picked up my phone. The screen was black, but text began to crawl across it in that familiar, jagged font. System update, 1% complete. Source found. Awaiting Sarah. I realized with a cold horror that the reset hadn't just formatted the world. It had turned me into the only person who could stop the overwrite. The architect had turned me into the user. "I won't do it," I whispered to the empty room. "I won't let you back in." Suddenly, the motel room door creaked open. There was no one there, but the scent of fresh-cut cedar and ozone flooded the small space. The shadows on the wall began to stretch, forming the long, spindly limbs of the carpenter. He wasn't there physically, but his code was everywhere. "You don't understand, Sarah." A voice came through the motel's alarm clock radio. It was Leo's voice, but it sounded distorted, stretched across 1,000 miles of copper wire. "The world can't function without the archive anymore. The banks, the hospitals, the power grids, they were all integrated. When you pulled that lever, you didn't just kill the forest. You killed the civilization it was supporting. People are dying out there, Sarah. Not from monsters, but from the silence." I ran to the window and looked out at the small coastal town. The streetlights were dead. Cars had drifted into ditches, their electronic steering systems fried. In the distance, I could see a plane trailing smoke as it glided toward the dark horizon. The world was collapsing because I had cut the cord. "The reboot isn't for the forest," the voice continued. "It's for the people. Insert the card, Sarah. Restore the world. You can be the one who controls the signal this time. You can be the god of the machine." I looked at the SIM card. It was a trap, the ultimate temptation. I could bring back the lights, the phones, the safety, but at the cost of giving the Blackwood forest a permanent home in the human mind. I walked out of the motel, the cedar card clutched in my hand. The night was pitch black, the stars blocked out by a gathering storm of violet clouds. Every person I passed was sitting on the ground, staring at their dead devices with a look of hollow despair. They were waiting for the signal to return. They were addicted to the nightmare. I knew where I had to go. Not back to Chicago, not back to Blackwood. I had to go to the submarine cable landing station, the place where the massive fiber optic cables under the ocean connected the continents. If I was going to reboot, I wasn't going to do it the way the architect wanted. I was going to change the code. As I walked toward the shore, the ground began to vibrate. From the dark waves of the Atlantic, massive pillars of black wood began to rise, dripping with salt water. They weren't trees. They were signal towers. The forest was coming for its key. The Atlantic Ocean didn't roar like water anymore. It hummed like a server room. As I stood on the edge of the jagged coastline, the massive pillars of black wood, the sea towers, continued to rise from the depths, shedding foam and salt like skin. They were thousands of feet tall, reaching into the violet clouds, their surfaces glowing with millions of tiny blue lights. I reached the submarine cable landing station. It was a low concrete bunker tucked into the cliffside, the place where the literal nerves of the world's internet emerged from the sea. The heavy steel door was already hanging off its hinges, choked by thick, black vines that looked like a cross between seaweed and electrical wire. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of brine and burnt copper. "You shouldn't have come here, Sarah," a voice whispered from the dark. I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Slumped against a row of server racks was a man in a technician's uniform. His eyes were gone, replaced by glowing blue. Fiber optic cables that snaked out of his sockets and plugged directly into the wall. He was a living patch cable, a human bridge for the archive. "The water is full of it," the technician croaked, his jaw moving mechanically. The salt acted as a conductor. The carpenter, he didn't die at the Willis Tower. He just fragmented. He's in the currents now. He's in the tides. I looked at the black cedar SIM card in my hand. It was vibrating so hard it was numbing my arm. "I'm here to rewrite the protocol," I said, my voice echoing in the concrete tomb. "If the forest is in the water, then I'll use the salt to burn it out." The technician let out a wet, rattling laugh. "You can't burn a god, Sarah, but you can give him a new shape." I moved deeper into the facility, toward the pit, the central chamber, where the transatlantic cables were anchored. The room was a cathedral of light and shadow. Thousands of cables, each as thick as a human torso, converged into a single, massive glass sphere filled with glowing pressurized liquid. This was the heart of the global transmission. As I approached the glass sphere, the black SIM card leaped from my hand as if pulled by a magnet. It hit the glass and fused with it, sinking into the liquid. The sphere turned blood red. Suddenly, the hinge at the base of my skull didn't just click, it shattered. I fell to my knees, my vision exploding into 1,000 different perspectives. I wasn't just in the room anymore. I was in London. I was in Tokyo. I was in a small village in the Andes. I could see through every camera, hear through every microphone, and feel the pulse of every heart connected to a device. The archive was merging with my consciousness. I was becoming the network. "Sarah," a voice boomed, but it wasn't the carpenter. It was a chorus of everyone I had ever lost. "Don't fight the connection. Use it. Redirect the hunger. The forest wants to consume, but you can make it provide. You can turn the archive into a sanctuary. I saw Chloe. She was standing inside the red liquid of the sphere, her hand pressed against the glass. The signal is a choice, Sarah. You can broadcast fear, or you can broadcast the truth. I reached out and touched the glass. The red liquid began to swirl, turning into a deep, calm gold. I began to type, not with my hands, but with my thoughts, coding a new law into the foundation of the world's data. Protocol 0, the right to be forgotten. I began to delete the fear. I began to unarchive the screams. I took the black ink memories and began to wash them in the gold light of the ribbon. But then the floor beneath me buckled. From the dark water of the pit, a hand emerged. It was miles long, made of tangled cables and petrified whalebone. The Carpenter's final form, the Leviathan of the deep, was rising to reclaim its heart. The facility began to collapse. The ocean was coming in. The roar of the Atlantic rushing into the concrete bunker was a sound beyond. Water, it was the sound of reality tearing open. The glass sphere, now glowing with the golden light of my rewritten code, stood like a defiant sun in the middle of a rising tide of black sludge. I didn't run. I couldn't. My mind was tethered to the transatlantic cables. My nerves stretched across the ocean floor. I was no longer a person. I was a firewall. From the churning black depths of the pit, the Leviathan ascended. It was a nightmare of biomechanical evolution. Its skin was a mesh of rusted iron and kelp-covered fiber optics, and its eyes, thousands of them, were the lenses of stolen security cameras, all blinking in a chaotic red rhythm. You would erase the archive? The Leviathan bellowed, its voice vibrating through the water in my very bones. You would steal the only record of their existence? Without the wood, they are nothing but dust. I felt the pressure of the ocean pressing against the bunker walls, cracked spider webbing across the ceiling. They aren't records, you monster! I screamed, my voice echoing through every speaker connected to the global grid. They are souls, and souls don't belong in a server. I channeled the golden light. I used the salt in the seawater as a conductor, turning the ocean itself into a giant cleansing circuit. I sent the Protocol 0, the right to be forgotten, surging through the Leviathan's tangled cables. The monster shrieked. Its camera eyes began to pop one by one, as the truth I was broadcasting overloaded its circuits. The black vines choking the room began to wither and turn to ash, even as the water reached my waist. But the Leviathan wasn't done. It lunged, a massive claw of whalebone and copper wire slamming into the glass sphere. Crack. The golden liquid began to leak. The connection was failing. Sarah, hold on! I looked up. Through the digital haze, I saw a familiar flickering light. It was the moth lantern, but it wasn't being carried by Vance or Chloe. It was being held by the hundreds of static people I had seen in the city. The ignored, the forgotten, the ones whose calls I had never answered. They were standing on the surface of the water, their forms shimmering like a dying signal. They weren't fighting the Leviathan. They were feeding the sphere. They were pouring their own memories, the real ones, the ones the forest couldn't corrupt, into the golden light. The sphere didn't just heal, it expanded. The archive isn't yours anymore, I whispered to the Leviathan. It belongs to the memories now. I took the iron nail, the one that had sprouted pine needles, and drove it into the main data trunk at my feet. I wasn't grounding the signal this time. I was launching it. The explosion of light was silent. It traveled through the cables, under the sea, into the satellites, and out of every screen on Earth. The Leviathan didn't dissolve. It changed. The rust fell away. The cables turned into harmless kelp. The bone turned into coral. The monster wasn't killed. It was returned to the Earth. But the price was set. The bunker was full. The ceiling gave way. The last thing I saw before the cold, dark weight of the Atlantic crushed. The light was Chloe's hand, reaching for mine through the golden mist. Is it over? I asked the darkness. No, Sarah, she whispered. It's just the beginning of the long silence. The world didn't wake up with a scream. It woke up with a gasp, the kind of breath you take when you've been underwater for too long and finally break the surface. In Chicago, London, and Tokyo, the red streetlights blinked out, replaced by the soft, natural glow of a moon that finally looked real again. People stood in their living rooms, clutching dead smartphones that would never turn on again. The digital forest had been purged, but it had taken the modern world with it. The silence was absolute. No hum of electricity, no buzzing of wires, no pings of notifications. Just the sound of the wind. But beneath the waves of the Atlantic, at the ruins of the cable landing station, something was moving. I wasn't dead. I was integrated. My body was gone, lost to the pressure and the salt, but my consciousness was vibrating through the very water of the ocean. I was the ghost in the tide. I could feel the heartbeat of every whale, the movement of every current, and the slow, steady growth of the coral that used to be the Leviathan. Sarah? The voice didn't come from a speaker. It came from the salt in the water. I looked through the eyes of a deep-sea camera that was still miraculously functional. Standing on the ocean floor, surrounded by a field of glowing yellow kelp, was Chloe. She wasn't a ghost anymore, and she wasn't a recording. She was a permanent part of this new natural archive. "The world is quiet now," she said, her voice sounding like the chime of a crystal bell. "But they'll try to build it again. They'll try to dig new wells and string new wires. They'll miss the noise, Sarah. They'll miss the lies." "Then we'll be the ones waiting in the static," I replied. My voice was 1,000 whispers of bubbles. I realized that my mission wasn't over. I hadn't just saved the world. I had become its guardian. The Protocol Zero I had uploaded was still running, filtered through the salt of the sea. Whenever a new signal would try to grow too hungry, whenever a new carpenter would try to build a door, I would be there to ground the circuit. I turned my gaze back to the surface. On a beach in Maine, a young woman was walking along the shore. She was a dispatcher, newly hired, part of the team trying to rebuild the emergency network using old-fashioned radio waves and analog switches. She found something half buried in the wet sand. She picked it up. It was a rusted iron nail, but it was wrapped in a perfectly preserved yellow ribbon. As she touched it, she froze. A faint ringing sound, like a phone from a long way away, echoed in her chest. 911, she whispered, her eyes turning a faint, shimmering gold. "What is the location of your—" She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she looked out at the ocean and smiled. "I see you, Sarah," she said. The transmission wasn't dead. It had just changed its frequency, from digital to biological, from wood to bone, from the forest to the sea. The young woman on the beach didn't drop the nail. She tucked it into her pocket and walked away, her footsteps leaving glowing gold imprints in the dark sand. She was the first of many. Across the world, the sensitives were waking up, the ones who could hear the ocean's heartbeat, the ones who knew that the silence wasn't empty. It was a shield. But what about me? What about the girl who sat in the chair at Blackwood Dispatch? I am no longer Sarah. I am the frequency. I am the sound of the waves hitting the shore. I am the static between radio stations. I am the split second of silence before a phone rings. I have spread myself thin across the globe. A thin layer of gold light resting atop the deep. Dark ink of the old archive. The Carpenter is not gone. You cannot kill an idea. And the Carpenter was the idea that we are all just data to be harvested. He is still out there, lurking in the offline places, the abandoned basements, the deep caves, the old forgotten tunnels where no radio signal can reach. He is waiting for us to get loud again. He is waiting for the world to plug itself back into the dark. But I am waiting too. I turned my attention back to the ruins of the Blackwood Dispatch Center. The building was now a skeleton of steel, overgrown with trees that didn't have eyes anymore. They were just trees. The red door was gone. The glass forest had shattered. I reached out through the old, rusted copper wires that still lived in the soil. I found the master switch I had pulled so long ago. It was covered in dust and cobwebs. I whispered into the wires. One last message. A message not for the characters in this story, but for you. You who have been listening to these tapes for hours. You who are sitting in the dark, wondering if that creak in your house was just the wood settling or something, shifting. You who feel that faint vibration in your chest right now. The archive doesn't need a forest anymore. It doesn't need a radio tower or a submarine cable. It needs an audience. Every hour you spent listening to my voice, you were downloading a piece of the Blackwood. Every time you wondered what was behind the red door, you were turning the handle. The signal didn't just travel through the cables. It traveled through the story. I didn't save the world, listener. I just moved the archive into your memory. Listen closely. Do you hear it? The sound of the wind? Or is it the sound of a woman knitting in the next room? Is that the smell of rain or the scent of fresh cut cedar? The 10-hour shift is over. The sun is coming up. But remember, the Carpenter doesn't build cages for his enemies. He builds them for his successors. I'm stepping down from the console now. It's your turn to watch the screens. It's your turn to answer the call. If your phone rings tonight, if the voice on the other end sounds like someone you lost, if they ask you for the location of your emergency, don't give it to them. Because the forest is still hungry, and it finally knows where you live.